Okay, let's get back to the start of our notes, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Part 1. Again, we're going to talk about, review the route of the 7th Cavalry to the Little Bighorn River, and we're going to talk about the route of Custer and Reno, so make sure you understand this. So looking at your maps and your notes, okay? Lieutenant Colonel Custer and Major Reno marched towards Ash Creek after they separated the battalions, which on your map is present-day Reno Creek, on their way to the Little Bighorn River Valley. At approximately 2 p.m., remember the regiment came across the Lone Teepee, which was the location of a big Sioux camp during the Battle of the Rosebud, and it was considered a ceremonial lodge for a warrior that was killed during the Battle of the Rosebud, and because of that it was considered sacred to all of Custer's scouts, despite which tribe they belonged to. And because of their spiritual beliefs about the burial grounds, Custer's scouts said they would travel no farther with him. Now, Custer was angry. He shouted for the scouts to move forward, and he stated to move forward, or quote, "I will take your guns and horses and make a woman out of you." One of the scouts in native tongue made a comment back to Custer. Custer asked Fred Gerard, who was the civilian interpreter for the civilian scouts, to tell him what the Indian scout had said to him, and Gerard basically informed Custer that the scout told him that if he made a woman out of all of his soldiers that were scared, it would take him a long time to do so. So there was some feeling that not only were the Crow Scouts scared, but also the soldiers were scared about what they were going to get themselves into. The Indian scout that was put in the most awkward position was Bloody Knife. He was very loyal to Custer. Custer had once gave him a medal that said "World's Greatest Scout." He also told Bloody Knife that when he got to be the great father or the president, that he would move Bloody Knife and his family to Washington and take care of him, provide him a home, take care of him. Now, Bloody Knife did not want to abandon Custer, but he had his spiritual beliefs as well. Now, at this point, when they're having this discussion, Fred Gerard, the civilian interpreter, spotted a group of Indians that were fleeing towards the Little Bighorn River, and he pointed to them, and he said to Custer, "Their general are your Indians, running like the devil." Now, after spotting the Indians, Custer sent Lieutenant W.W. Cook to Major Reno, who was a ways from him, not a long distance, but a ways, and he gave him the following order. He said, quote, "General Custer directs that you take as fast a gait as you deem prudent and charge afterward, and you will be supported by the whole outfit." And it was the only and last communication Reno received from Custer ever. It was at this point that Custer let Bloody Knife off the hook as far as the Lone Teepee, and he ordered him to go with Reno, okay, which was away from that area. And Bloody Knife appreciated the gesture and stated to Custer, "Today you and I go home on a road we do not know," making the comment they're not sure what was going to happen to him. Now, most of the Indian scouts went with Reno. However, who is the notable Indian scout that stayed with Custer? No, not Boyer. Curley. Okay, Curley. And Boyer stayed with him also, and he was a civilian scout. Now, the 7th Cavalry, as you see by your map, then departed from the Lone Teepee, where Custer finally split from Reno over a ridge and turned north. Reno crossed the Little Bighorn River and stopped to gather his troops, and for the next 15 to 20 minutes, Reno and his command adjusted their cinches, checked their equipment, checked their guns and ammunition, and prepared themselves for a charge. Custer did not cross the Little Bighorn River. Again, he advanced along the bluffs overlooking the river and would actually watch Reno engage. Okay? Now we talk about the route of Captain Benteen, which was much different. You can again see this on your map. Captain Frederick Benteen marched southeast as ordered by Custer to protect the left flank. And finally, after seeing no Indians, after traveling a distance, Benteen considered the march what? A wild goose chase. And he made the decision to find Custer, but travel was slow. Remember, the pack train, Josh, was how far behind Benteen? 2 miles. Okay, and then they approached a creek of swampland known as a morass, and they caught wind, so to speak, or smelt the water, and they rushed into the swampland and got bogged down and stuck because they were carrying about 2,000 pounds with them, 100-round ammunition boxes. So it even took longer for Benteen to find Custer because of the wait for the pack train. Now, so Benteen stops, he waters his horses, he waits for the pack train, and he waits for sign from Custer. Which took us to the Valley fight, the Reno charge retreat. And we talked to you about Reno leading the charge toward the Little Bighorn River at the Indian camp. He ordered his men to form a skirmish line. Remember, a long skirmish line. Each man was about 15 feet apart, and each fourth man had the responsibility of what? Holding horses. So during that initial charge toward the Indian village, Privates George Smith and Henry Turley lost control of their horses. This resulted in the two soldiers riding directly into the Indian camp, and both were killed. Who was actually the first casualty? Smith. Smith was, okay? Now, Reno sets up the skirmish line. They fight for about 15 minutes. His forces receiving severe pressure from their left flank from Chief Gall and his warriors. And as a result, Major Reno does what, Mauricio? What does he order his men to do? Because of the tremendous pressure they're taking from their left flank.
Oh, the line.
He orders a 45-degree oblique turn to his left, and he forms a second skirmish line that was closer to the river. Okay? Now, Lieutenant Donald McIntosh and Company G were protecting Reno's command on the right flank, and they were actually fighting Sioux and Cheyenne warriors and were being heavily hit by both the Indian assault and a fire that had been started to hinder their position. Remember, they were over there battling a grass fire. Reno then took companies A and M, and he moved closer and closer to the Little Bighorn River. Okay? And he stopped with his men at a lone tree, which was approximately halfway between the second skirmish line and the river. And he was asking advice and opinion from Scout Bloody Knife. And what happened, AD, at that tree?
Bloody Knife got shot in the back of the head.
He got shot right in the head, and the brains and blood splattered all over Reno's face. He panicked, and he ordered the command to mount and dismount 3 different times at that point. And finally, he asked his men to follow him on a charge, which was actually a retreat back across the river to higher ground. Now, McIntosh and Company G, who were furiously fighting that grass fire and those Indians, could not hold their position anymore, and they decided to retreat with Reno as well. And during that attempt, McIntosh was killed. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, the remainder of the retreat was basically mass confusion and chaos. Reno's men tried frantically to get themselves back across the river and up on the high bluffs, which you'll get a chance to see. Okay? Lieutenant Charles Varnum was later quoted as saying about the skedaddle that when we came out of the woods, there was a great many Indians scampering along with their rifles across the saddle, working their Winchesters on the column, meaning on the men. Fred Gerard recollected, the Indians picked off the troops at will. It was a rout. And on top of the higher ground, Reno was quoted as saying, I've lost half of my men. Well, in reality, he lost 40 men killed and 13 wounded. Okay? We mentioned that the waters of the Little Bighorn River flowed in red as many of the soldiers were killed in the river. And after Reno's retreat across the Little Bighorn River to higher ground, what did the Indians do? They stopped their assault and turned towards what? Custer. And what time was it on June 25th, 1876 when that occurred? 4 p.m. Okay, that'll take us to our new stuff now, which is key personalities killed during the Reno charge. And basically, we're just going to tell you what happened to them. Some you've heard of, some you have not. And the first person we're going to talk about is Donald McIntosh. What happened to Donald McIntosh? Okay? Donald McIntosh. So get your notes kind of organized if you would. Okay, Donald McIntosh. Now, after his death, he was originally buried on the battlefield on June 27, 1876. So after his death, he was originally buried on the battlefield. Donald McIntosh, that's what we're talking about. So, along with many other soldiers, most of them were buried on the battlefield the 27th. And we'll talk about what happened to him later, but we're talking specifically about Donald McIntosh. He was originally buried on the battlefield on June 27, 1876, right? Pretty much where he fell. okay? And that would be in the Reno Charge area, which is different than Custer's Last Stand. We're going to talk about that later.
Wait, what was the date?
June 27th, 1876. What happened basically is when Terry's column came upon this disaster, they buried the soldiers pretty much where they fell, okay, in shallow graves. Most of them were exhumed and buried elsewhere, you know what I mean? There's not any soldiers actually buried at the battlefield where they fell. They've all been exhumed, and I'll tell you where they're at later. Well, he was reburied at Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery. So McIntosh was exhumed in July of 1877, about a year and a month later, and he was reburied at Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery, which is in Kansas. Okay? So McIntosh was originally buried on the battlefield on June 27, 1876. He was exhumed in July of 1877 and reburied at Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery in Kansas. Okay? He was re-exhumed again in October of 1909. And guess where he's buried now? Pretty prestigious cemetery.
Custer Memorial.
No? What'd you say?
Custer Memorial.
No, that's a good guess. Bigger than Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. So I've been by and seen his gravesite there. So he was exhumed in July of 1877 and reburied in Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery in Kansas. Then he was re-exhumed again in October of 1909, and they buried him in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia.
Who's the person that decides to move?
The military. Yeah.
You said 1809.
I'm sorry,
1909?
1909, yeah. 1909, and he was reburied in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. What about his widow? His wife's name was Molly, M-O-L-L-Y. And she received a military pension of $30 a month until she died on May 12, 1910. Okay? So McIntosh's widow, Molly, received a military pension of $30 a month for the rest of her life, and she died in 1910.
How much would that be, like that check be nowadays?
I'd say $300 a month, probably, which isn't a lot. Now, I get goosebumps telling the story. I had an unbelievable experience at the Reno Charge area many years ago. I don't think I've told you this story, but a guy by the name of Jason Pitch. Did I tell you this story?
No.
Jason Pitch's family owns the Reno Charge area. It's a different land than the Custer, where Custer was killed. Now it's been purchased by the Little Bighorns Preservation Committee, and the government owns it. But at this time, Jason Pitch owned it. And he got excited one time with a friend, which I'll tell the story later. And they had an archaeological dig there on the Reno Charge area, where nobody else can dig because it was private. And they found Donald McIntosh's wedding ring. I had it on my finger. Found his wedding ring. Okay? Now, how do we know that was his?
You know?
Huh?
It was engraved.
It was engraved DM plus MM equals 66. Donald McIntosh plus Molly McIntosh equals 1866. And here is the ring right here.
That's the one he wore?
This is his wedding ring that was found on the battlefield.
That's one of them that's here.
This is what I had on my finger. It was unbelievable. I'll tell you, when we get all done with this, I'm going to tell you the whole story behind that whole thing, behind Jason Pitch and the whole thing. It's an unbelievable, interesting, but sad story. But that's the wedding ring, and I'll just kind of maybe pass this around, you can look at it. But that's the wedding ring that belonged to Donald McIntosh that was found, I'm going to guess about 2000. Now, don't quote me on it, but about 2000. Okay, the next key personality we're going to talk about, you've heard of, Charlie Reynolds. Remember Charlie Reynolds? He was the scout, okay? Guide and scout during the expedition. He went up to the Crow's Nest, remember? With Barnum and the Crow Scouts to get an idea where the village was. And Custer, maybe, remember, came up there later. Okay? Well, he also was with Reno. Charlie Reynolds was. And there was a doctor by the name of Henry Porter. I don't have it on your ID sheet. You don't really need to know it, but it's a good story. There was a doctor by the name of Henry Porter that was with Reno's crew as the doctor. And Reynolds stopped near Dr. Porter, who was treating a wounded man during this Reno charge and retreat. Okay, is he making sense to you? So, during the fight, and again, he's not attached to AG or M, he's a civilian scout and guide. He's with the expedition. He's with Reno. And he, during the battling, stops near Dr. Henry Porter because Porter was treating someone that was wounded. And what do you think Reynolds was trying to get Porter to do?
Leave.
Get out of here. Let's go. We got to get up to the bluffs or you're going to be killed. Okay? Well, it took him a while, and Reynolds finally convinced Dr. Porter to retreat. And just as Porter got up to depart, Reynolds was shot right through the heart and killed. Okay? So again, Charlie Reynolds during the Reno charge and retreat stopped and tried to convince Dr. Henry Porter to get to the high bluffs, okay? Because they were under heavy fighting. And Porter first refused to leave the wounded man, but finally he convinced him and said, hey, it's either you or them. And just as Porter stood up and took off to go up toward the bluffs, Reynolds was shot right through the heart and killed.
Those Indians must have been pretty good.
Now, here's the ironic thing about this. Charlie Reynolds went down as a hero. Why? Because he was the one that convinced Dr. Porter to get up to the high ground. And what was Dr. Porter's contribution once he did successfully, which he did, get to the high ground? Treated a lot of wounded soldiers and saved their lives. So Charlie Reynolds was a hero. His action to give his life to get the doctor up to the bluffs saved many wounded soldiers up at what they know as the Reno-Benteen battlefield, where they ended up on top of the bluffs. So Charlie Reynolds was a key contributor and lost his life. Okay? Now we're going to talk about a guy named Isaiah Doorman, which I believe is on your ID sheet, is he not? Isaiah Doorman. This is kind of an interesting story. What was he the only one in the 7th Cavalry? Isaiah Doorman. What do you think of the name?
Jewish.
He was black. He was the only African American or black soldier in the 7th Cavalry. Now, this isn't meant to be rude or stick out or be mean, but he stood out, right? I mean, no question about it. He was easy to pick out by the Native Americans. And what did they see him as? Kind of intriguing, right?
They didn't kill him.
No, we'll get to the story. He was an interpreter also. And he was paid $75 a month compared to the soldier that was making $13 a month.
I think isn't it like one of the chiefs trying to rub him?
Okay, just a second. What's that? He made $75 a month, which is a lot of money in those days, compared to a soldier of $13, because he was good at what he did, but he was black. Okay? Now, he was an interpreter for the Custer Battalion. He was paid $75 a month. He was actually married to a Sioux woman. And Sitting Bull knew Isaiah Doorman. He knew who he was, okay, prior to the battle. So Isaiah Doorman was the only black soldier in the 7th Cavalry. He was an interpreter. He was very good at what he did. He made $75 a month compared to the normal Army soldier that made $13 a month. He was also married to a Sioux woman, and he was known personally by Sitting Bull prior to the battle. Now, this was something to think about. Here he is trying to retreat to the bluffs, and he has his horse shot out from under it. And all of a sudden he looks up and he's surrounded by what?
Indians.
Hostiles. Okay, quite a position. Now, when you think about his background, what do you think his fate was, so to speak?
He's dead.
Okay, not only was dead, he was badly tortured prior to his death, and he was found with many arrows shot into his body and head. They went out of their way to torture this guy and make his death as brutal as possible. Okay? He was badly slashed. He was shot in the legs, both legs with buckshot. And his genitals were staked to the ground with a horse stake. Seriously. So I'll repeat that, write down what you think you need to. If you're a boy in here, you're already thinking, I'll remember that. But anyway, he was badly tortured prior to death. He was found with many arrows shot into his body and head. In addition, he was badly slashed. In other words, they took knives and slashed him. He was shot in both legs with buckshot, and his genitals were staked to the ground with a horse stake. And a horse stake is just this big round rod that people, tied their horses to. It would not be pleasurable. And all of this happened to him probably before what? Before he died. So all this happened to him more than likely before he died. So they tortured him. So I'm guessing the arrow part of it, when he was filled with arrows, was probably the end. And the rest of this, the slashing, the shooting in both legs with buckshot, and his genitals being staked to the ground with a horse stake, I'm guessing all that happened prior to his death. So talk about how bad could it be. Now, this is even weirder. Listen up. An army cup was placed on his chest, half full of blood, and he was badly mutilated. So when they found him, he had an army cup that they had found, somebody had found during the battle, a hostile. It was half full of blood. Nobody knows whose, probably his, sitting on his chest, and he was badly mutilated. That would be not a good fate. Okay? Okay, any questions on Isaiah Doorman? Okay, we will move to Bloody Knife and tell you a little bit about him. We know how he was killed, but let's talk about what happened afterwards a little bit later. Okay, now remember, Bloody Knife was half Sioux and half what? Anybody remember? Arikara. Okay, he was half Sioux and half Arikara. And he had a very poor home life with the Sioux family when he was growing up. They picked on him all the time. They teased him, chastised him. Why? He was half